Human Rights Watch. Torture and other abuses against Venezuelans in El Salvador mega prison. The nightmare began the moment they took me off the plane. Gonzalo, 26-year-old from Zulia State, Venezuela, July 31st, 2025. The United States removed Gonzalo and 251 other Venezuelans to El Salvador on March and April 2025. When the plane landed, officers forced him and others to kneel with their heads down, he said. He told one of them he had a spine problem and he could not bend his head low, but one officer stuck him with a baton in the back of the neck on a bus to the maximum security prison known as the Center for Terrorism Confinement. Guards beat him again, he said. When we arrived at the entrance of C-COT, guards made us kneel so that we could shave our heads, Gonzalo said. One of the officers hit me on the leg with the baton, and I fell to the ground on my knees. Everyone, he said, was subjected to the same torture. The prison director told us, "You have arrived in hell." In C-COT, guards and riot police beat and abused the Venezuelans constantly. The guards beat me many times in the hallways of the prison module and in the punishment cell, Gonzalo said. They beat us almost every day. The Venezuelans were held incommunicado in the C-COT maximum security prison for approximately 4 months, until July 18th, when they were sent to Venezuela as part of a prisoner exchange between El Salvador and Venezuela. The joint report by Human Rights Watch and Crystal Sol provides the most comprehensive account to the data of the treatment of these people endured during detention in El Salvador and includes the first detailed account of the treatment of detainees in C-COT. We interviewed 40 people who had been held in C-COT and other 150 people with the credible knowledge of the experience of the Venezuelans detained there. Including relatives and lawyers, we received a wide range of documents including photographs of injuries, criminal records, and judicial documents in El Salvador and the United States, and also consulted international forensic experts. The governments of the United States and El Salvador accused most of these people of being terrorists, part of Tren de Agua, a Venezuelan organized crime group, and the United States has designated as a foreign terrorist organization. However, Human Rights Watch and Crystal Sol's review of criminal record background documents indicates that many of them had not been convicted of any crime by federal or state authorities in the United States, nor in Venezuela or other Latin American countries where they had lived. Human Rights Watch and Crystal Sol found that 252 Venezuelans were subjected to what amounts to arbitrary detention and enforced disappearance under international human rights law. Gonzalo's mother said her son called her on March 13th from immigration detention in the United States to tell her he was going to be deported to Venezuela, where he would give her a birthday hug he owed her. I held on that promise, but he did not arrive, his mother said. As days has passed without information, she felt unbearable pain. The family called multiple detention centers, but U.S. authorities denied information on his whereabouts. They only said that he had been removed from the United States. About a week later, a friend told Gonzalo's mother that he had found Gonzalo's name on a list published by a media outlet, naming the Venezuelans who had been sent to C-COT. She searched for videos and photos of the deported men, hoping to recognize him, but she didn't find him. From the moment everything went dark, she said all she felt was anguish, pain, anger, and despair. Human Rights Watch and Crystal Sol found that people held in C-COT were subjected to inhumane prison conditions, including prolonged incommunicado detention, inadequate food, denial of basic hygiene and sanitation, limited access to health and care and medicine, and lack of recreational or educational activities, in violation of several provisions of the United Nations Standards Minimum Rules for the Treatment of Prisoners, also known as the Mandela Rules. We also documented that detainees were subjected to constant beatings and other forms of ill treatment, including some cases of sexual violence. Many of these abuses constitute torture under international human rights law. People held in C-COT said that they were beaten from the moment they arrived in El Salvador and throughout the time in detention. Guards and riot police beat them in the hallway in the prison module and in solitary confinement cells in a section of C-COT known as the Island. They beat them during daily call searches for allegedly violating prison rules such as speaking loudly with other detainees or showering at the wrong time, and sometimes for requesting medical treatment. People held in C-COT said that many detainees were also have been beaten after U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem's visit in March, following visits by the International Committee of the Red Cross, and in May, June, and after two prison protests occurred in April and May. Human Rights Watch and Crystal Sol concluded that the cases of torture and ill treatment of Venezuelans in C-COT were not isolated incidents by rogue guards or riot police, but rather systematic violations that took place repeatedly during their detention. Every former detainee interviewed reported being subjected to serious physical and psychological abuse on a nearly daily basis throughout their entire time in detention. These beatings and other abuses appear to be part of the practice designated to subjugate, humiliate, and discipline detainees through the imposition of grave physical and psychological suffering. Officers also appear to have acted on the belief that their superiors either supported or tolerated their abusive acts. Daniel B., for instance, described how officers beat him after he spoke with the ICRC staff members during their visit to C-COT in May. He said that guards took him to the island where they beat him with a baton. He said, "A blow made his nose bleed. They kept hitting me in the stomach, and when I tried to breathe, I started to choke on the blood. My cellmate shouted for help, saying that they were killing us. But the officers said that they just wanted to make us suffer," he said. The people in C-COT told Human Rights Watch and Crystal Sol that they were subjected to sexual violence. One of them said that the guards took him to the island where they beat him. He said 4 guards sexually abused him and forced him to perform oral sex on them. "They played with their batons on my body." People held in C-COT said sexual abuse affected more people, but victims were unlikely to speak about what they had suffered because of stigma. Human rights violations documented in the report violate El Salvador's obligations under international law, including the prohibition on arbitrary detention, enforced disappearance and torture, and other ill treatment. U.S. officials repeatedly denied relatives of people sent to C-COT information on their whereabouts, making the U.S. government complicit in their enforced disappearance. The U.S. government also violated its legal obligations to respect the principles of non-refoulement by transferring Venezuelan migrants to El Salvador, despite easily foreseeable risk of torture and ill treatment. Many people who were held in C-COT said that they continue to suffer physical and long-lasting injuries and psychological trauma. "I'm on alert all the time because every time I heard the sound of keys and handcuffs, it made me think that they were coming to beat us," one of them said. The Venezuelans who were detained in C-COT have since been returned to their home country. Venezuela suffers a humanitarian crisis and systematic human rights violations carried out by the administration of Nicolas Maduro, which have compelled nearly 8 million people to flee. Some of the people in C-COT had fled abuses by Maduro government and its security forces and faces the risk of persecution in Venezuela. The repatriation to Venezuela violates the principle of non-refoulement. Additionally, in some cases, members of the Venezuelan intelligence service have been appeared at the homes of people who were held in C-COT and forced them to record videos regarding their treatment in the United States. Human Rights Watch and Crystal Sol call on the U.S. government to end all transfer or third country nationals to El Salvador. We also urge foreign governments and international human rights bodies, including the United Nations Human Rights Council, to substantially step up their public scrutiny of the U.S. government's human rights violations against migrants, as well as El Salvador's widespread human rights violations against detainees. "We are not terrorists, we are migrants," one of the people held in C-COT said. "We went to the United States to seek protection and the chance for a better future. We ended up in a prison in a country we didn't even know, treated worse than animals." Recommendations to the U.S. government. End any transfer or removal of third country nationals and other people at risk or abuse to El Salvador. Given prior reports of torture and ill treatment in Salvadoran prisons and the evidence included in this report, Stop the expulsion of involuntary transfer of non-citizens to third countries to which they have no genuine ties. Disclose any agreements with El Salvador related to transfers or detention of U.S. transferred non-citizens. Cease all funding to El Salvador's police, army, prison system, and attorney general's office until the government adopts verifiable steps to ensure accountability for and non-reoccurrence of human rights violations documented in this report. Issue an executive order re-signing the proclamation of March 14, 2025, which invoked the Alien Enemies Act to deport migrants to third countries. Ensure that the Venezuelan migrants who were deported to El Salvador and under the Alien Enemies Act and who are now in Venezuela have a genuine opportunity to return to the United States to continue their asylum claims, should they wish to do so. Refrain from removing people to countries where there are reasonable grounds to believe that they would be subject to torture and any other serious abuses, as required under the principle of non-refoulement established among others in the United Nations Convention Against Torture. Respect the right under U.S. law of any person who is physically present in the United States who have arrived in the United States, whether or not as a designated port of arrival, irrespective of the person's status, to apply for asylum. Take measures to ensure protection for Venezuelans, migrants, and asylum seekers. These include respecting the legal status of people who arrive in the United States under humanitarian parole, extending the temporary protected status designated for Venezuelans, recognizing the ongoing conditions and risks that prevent many Venezuelans from returning to their country in safety. Ensure that any financial, technical, or security assistance to El Salvador prison system, including C-COT, is conditioned on demonstrable improvements to detention conditions, treatment of detainees, and accountability for abuses, consistent with the international human rights law. To Salvadorian government, take urgent and effective measures to prevent torture and ill treatment in detention facilities, including by ensuring independent oversight, adequate training and personal accountability mechanisms, and access to legal counsel and medical care for detainees. Conduct credible investigations on the abuses suffered by Venezuelan migrant transfers to C-COT from the United States, including beating, sexual violence, forced nudity, and other forms of ill treatment, and hold those responsible, including command-level officials, accountable. Provide all detainees in C-COT and other detention facilities in the country with adequate food, safe drinking water, bedding, hygiene products, and access to natural light and ventilation to prevent inhumane, degrading treatment. Restrict the transfer of all detainees in C-COT and other detention facilities to solitary confinement to the maximum extent possible, ensuring its use remains exceptional, proportionate, and subject to strict oversight and judicial review. Strictly limit the duration of confinement and solitary confinement, particularly for detainees with pre-existing health conditions. Ensure timely and adequate access to health care for all detainees in the country's penitentiary system, including mental health services and uninterrupted provision of prescribed medications consistent with international health standards. And end the incommunicado detention regime of all detainees in El Salvador. Ensure that all detainees can exercise their right to legally counsel by facilitating confidential meetings with lawyers, providing adequate access to telephones, and guaranteeing timely information about their legal rights and ongoing proceedings during processing. Allow regular, unannounced access by independent oversight bodies, including the International Committee on the Red Cross and relevant United Nations and inter-American mechanisms, to all detainee areas, including punishment cells. Ensure that they select relevant United Nations and inter-American mechanisms to all detention areas, including punishment cells, to ensure that they select interviewees and conduct confidential interviews. Guarantee strict non-retaliation protection from detainees who speak with humanitarian and humanitarian right monitors, ensuring that all allegations of reprisal and promptly and independent investigated and hold responsible officials accountable. Create and maintain accurate publicly accessible registries of all people detained in C-COT and other prisons, including data of transfer, legal basis of detention, and contact with relatives, to prevent new and forced disappearances. Reduce prison overcrowding at C-COT and other detention facilities by ending unnecessary or prolonged pretrial detention and establishing an ad hoc review mechanism that one identifies cases involving higher level gang leaders and perpetrators of violent crimes by gang, including homicides, rape, and sexual assault, disappearances, and child recruitment, which should be prioritized for investigators and prosecutions that respect due process and other fundamental rights. And two, identifies cases of people who have been detained without adequate credible evidence and whom authorities should promptly release. The mechanism should prioritize reviewing cases of children, people with disabilities, pregnant women, and people with serious health conditions. Two, Venezuelan governments respect the rights of Venezuelan nationals returned from El Salvador, including by ensuring that they are not subjected to reprisal or stigmatization for having left Venezuela. Immediately ending any surveillance and harassment by state authorities, including the Bolivarian National Intelligence Service, against returnees and their families, providing access to medical and psychological care, legal assistance, and the reassurance of identity documents. To other governments, including members of Organizations of America states and European countries, publicly and privately condemn human rights violations committed by the United States against migrants transfers to C-COT, and urge the United States to end the transfer of third nationals to countries where they have no meaningful connections and the transfer of any migrant to places where they would likely be exposed to torture. Publicly and privately condemn human rights violations in El Salvador's prison and urge El Salvador to conduct prompt, thorough, and impartial investigations into allegations of torture, ill treatment, and other abuses at C-COT and other prisons, and ensure that those responsible, including command-level officials, are held accountable. Calls all funding to El Salvador's police, army, prison system, and attorney general office until the government adopts verifiable steps to ensure accountability for all non-reoccurrence of human rights violations documented in this report. To the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Migrants, and the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. Investigate allegations of ill treatment, torture, and other abuses in C-COT, as well as in other prisons in El Salvador, and report to them publicly, including to the UN Human Rights Council. To the UN Committee Against Torture. Investigate allegations of torture in C-COT in other prisons, and consider invoking the procedure established in Article 20 of the Convention Against Torture for countries where torture is systematically practiced. To the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, publicly and privately condemn human rights violations committed by Salvadorian security forces at C-COT. In the Commission's next annual report, consider including El Salvador in Chapter 5B, which highlights countries' situations where there is a systematic infringement of the independence of the judiciary, where the free exercise of the rights guaranteed in the American Declaration of the American Convention have been unlawfully suspended, or where the state has committed or is committing massive, serious, and widespread violations of human rights, among others. Mythology. Between March 21st and September 2, 2025, Human Rights Watch conducted telephone interviews with 150 people, including relatives, friends, employers, lawyers of detainees who provided credible information about the people sent to C-COT. These people were located in Venezuela, Colombia, and the United States. Human Rights Watch interviewed 40 people who were held in C-COT following their release from prison on July 18th. Based on information provided by the interviews, Human Rights Watch and Crystal Sol documented 130 cases of Venezuelan migrants whom the Trump administration transferred to the C-COT prison. 125 of them were sent to C-COT on March 15th, 4 on March 30th, and on April 12th, and 1 on April 12th. Crystal Sol provided legal assistance to the relative of 76 Venezuelans held in C-COT, helping them file habeas corpus petitions before El Salvador's Supreme Court. Interviews were conducted in English and Spanish. Researchers explained the purpose and voluntary nature of the interviews and how Human Rights Watch and Crystal Sol would use the information. All participants gave informed consent and understood that they would not receive any form of compensation. Interviewees were informed that they could end the interview at any time. To protect interviewees from possible reprisal, and given that the several former detainees are pursuing legal action against the governments of the United States and El Salvador, Human Rights Watch and Crystal Sol have withheld their names and used pseudonyms. The report does not decline identifying information unless explicit consent was provided, and even then, only when doing so does that pose a risk to the individual. We have used anonymous, even in some cases with the interviewees have previously spoken to journalists, agreed to be publicly identified by their full name. Human Rights Watch and Crystal Sol also analyzed documents provided by relative lawyers of detainees, including identity documents issued by the Venezuelan government, and in some cases, identity and social security documents issued by the United States. We also reviewed immigration documents issued by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, asylum and temporary protected status applications, Safe Mobility Program documentation, CBP one application records, as well as court filings and other legal documents submitted by detainees and lawyers. Human Rights Watch analyzed data on U.S. immigration and customer enforcement and removal operations, deportations, that ICE released in response to a Freedom of Information Act request made by the UCLA Center for Immigration Law and Policy. Analysis in the report based on the late July release made public by the Deportation Data Project. The data is supported to include every deportation made by ICE. Crime data is the most serious charge that ICE has in the database and is standardized according to National Crime Information Center codes. Analysis also used arrest and detention data released under the same FOIA request and linked to the deportation data by an anonymous identification variable. Researchers also reviewed criminal background certificates from Venezuela, the United States, and other countries where the detainees had previously lived, including Colombia, Chile, Ecuador, and Peru. We reviewed U.S. states and federal court records. We also reviewed sworn statements from some former detainees about the risk that led them to flee Venezuela, as well as statements from relatives, employers, and others putting into question the U.S. government claims that the detainees have any connection with Tren de Agua. In addition, Human Rights Watch and Crystal Sol consulted that ICE online detainees locator system to review the status of several deportees and confirm that they had been removed from the system after the transfer to El Salvador. Researchers also examined records in the Executive Office for Immigration Review online database to corroborate information about immigration proceedings for the most of the detainees. Open source research such as provided by students of the Investigation Lab of the Human Rights Center at the University of California, Berkeley.